So we're in kind of the middle of something. We're in the middle of a kind of very close reading look at individual Cubist works by Picasso and Braque. We've kind of narrowed ourselves down, not to every work they did. That would be impossible. That would take such a long time. But we're going quite slowly, I suppose, looking at the gradual evolution of the language of Cubism. It evolved over time. It didn't all sort of come into being. Could you pull the door slightly too, but not close? Thanks. It's a language that kind of evolved over time. It took them time to work out what it was they were doing, because they didn't. It didn't start with a theory and then move to a practice. Arguably, there isn't really a sort of endpoint either to the process. That dialogue maybe comes to an end in 1914. I would say around then is the time when the basic language of Cubism was already established. But that end date is not because they'd reached some artistic plateau and they didn't need to go any further, or they reached the peak of a mountain, they didn't need to go any further. It was because the First World War started. You know, Braque was called up as a soldier because he's a French citizen. Picasso wasn't, he's a Spaniard. So that's when their very, very close dialogue came effectively to an end. And they both go on producing works that are Cubist in inspiration after that. Braque almost exclusively. Picasso alongside other quite different kind of art. But the dialogue dimension of it, which is fairly unusual in the whole history of art in a way, such a close dialogue between two people creating a radically new style. That is something that just belongs to those few years after 1907 and the Demoiselles d'Avignon, the creation of that breakthrough work. So just as that work itself was, I don't think Picasso knew what he'd achieved. Cubism was part of his process of trying to find out what it meant, as it were. But it seemed he couldn't do it on his own, and although certainly Picasso's reputation is much higher generally as an artist than that of Braque, when it comes to Cubism itself, that shouldn't mislead us into thinking that Braque's contribution was considerably less. In many ways, as we've already seen, he was at the forefront of the development of Cubism. His concerns were slightly different from Picasso's as well. So despite the fact they were almost deliberately trying to make their work seem similar, almost a kind of anonymous style, there are differences, and maybe the differences of their concerns actually helps to push things forward. You know, there's a slight dissonance between what they're trying to achieve, and that kind of makes the dialogue interesting. You know, like having a conversation with a friend who doesn't quite agree with you about everything. Maybe you have a more productive laying out of what the grounds of the issues are, you know, than with someone who says, I 100% agree to everything that you just said. You're on the same page, as it were. It really was a radical movement. You know, if the title of this course, Vision in Crisis, refers to anything, it could refer to that moment of Cubism. It's really the definitive moment where the whole Renaissance tradition was self-consciously put aside or broken down in some way. Perspective, modeling, those two tools of Western art, or the project of realism, project of mimeticism, of illusionism, sort of comes to an end at that time. It's not really that artists never painted a realist image after Cubism. Many have, but somehow realism has been dethroned. It's no longer the natural way. It's just one possible way, and modern artists who use realist styles are kind of aware of it as a style. The distinction between realism and truthfulness starts to emerge. You can paint in a realist style, but that doesn't mean what you're saying is true about the world. So Cubism's somehow not trying to depart from truthfulness or adequacy to lived reality, but I think this is kind of important because many people have tried to see it as one stage towards a concern purely with formal things in modern art. That's now less common, but in many of the older books, for instance, you might come across such an idea that modern art becomes more concerned just with form. Certainly it is concerned with form. We could hardly understand the flatness of a Gauguin painting or whatever without understanding that these are artists concerned more with the flat surface of painting itself. But were the Cubists concerned with form just for its own sake? Maybe not. Maybe they're trying to draw your attention to the painting as a painting, the fact that it is a made object. So, for example, in this work by Picasso, the portrait of Vollard, it's you're very aware that the image is made up of fragmented planes of paint. But that's not because he's not interested in subject matter at all. You see the planes of paint, but you also see Vollard. There's a sort of balance between the two. It isn't that reality has been abandoned, because otherwise why would he bother to paint a portrait? Because portraiture is the very kind of subject matter where you're concerned with particularities. You could easily abstract a landscape, couldn't you? Many abstract artists found their way to abstraction through the genre of landscape. Why choose portraiture? I think it's because he is still interested in the real world. Maybe realism can falsify how we actually experience reality. Maybe our real phenomenological experience of reality is adding together impressions from different viewpoints. We're constantly moving as spectators. We're not in a static position opposite a vanishing point. We're adding information from two eyes at the same time. Our head will move, our body will move as we're painting a particular image. It's an accumulation over time of impression. So Cubism, I think, arguably it does give you a better sense of that's how we relate to the world, an accumulation of the impressions. And yeah, there's a fragmentation. Well, I suppose what I would say then is it's not an art movement where the past has just been left behind. The perspective and the modelling of the Renaissance tradition are not absent here at all. Modelling is actually very, 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 very present to our awareness. There's lots of it going on. It's just that all the modelling doesn't add up to anything. We look at each little bit of information about modelling, we see modelling going on, but each fragmented plane is modelled, but together all those cues about modelling don't add up to a sense of a volumetric sense. So it's not that he's abandoned the methods of the Renaissance, he's actually using it, but using it to sort of undermine it, using it against itself. It's almost more, you would say, like a sort of deconstructive strategy. It's present, but it's not seen to work, or it's seen to be trickery, by using it in a way that is sort of contradictory, it doesn't add up. You reveal it as trickery. When I quoted Picasso last week as saying, that long quote about that ended up with it saying, the artist has to try and convince us of the truthfulness of his lies. Maybe he's sort of saying, well, art can be active in helping us to represent the world. Realism can look realistic, a realist painting can look realistic, not because it's truthful in some absolute sense, but because it's just painted the way we normally paint reality. There's a funny little essay by the English writer Oscar Wilde called "The Influence of I don't know the exact title. I'm just from memory. The influence of Impressionism on the English weather," something like that. And he sort of jokingly sort of argues that since the Impressionist painters have painted their painting, the weather has changed in England, and it's become much more misty and sort of vague, and Of course, what he's saying is that art influences how we look at the world. We see different things. So maybe the first viewers of Impressionism found it unrealistic, actually, in many ways. People complained to the patches of light on a Renoir nude that it looks like rotting flesh or something like that. Now, maybe we characteristically look at the world as made up of dappled patches of light because we've consumed so much Impressionism. So Cubism seems to buy into that kind of logic, although it's doing something a little bit different from Impressionism. It's not just offering us a new way of thinking about the world, a new way of representing the world. It's talking about perhaps the process of representation itself. Now, we could say a lot of the art we've been looking at in this course is, in a sense, art about art, or art becomes a kind of second subject of the work itself. And I think that's more so with Cubism than with Gauguin or Cézanne. Vollard was an art dealer, and someone from Picasso's circle. So painting someone he knows well. I think, like I said before, your portraiture is the kind of art genre where we most sort of look for individuality or specificity. It matters whether the nose is in the right center of the face or not. You can move a tree around a landscape, and probably a lot of people wouldn't even notice. They've never seen the landscape. But even if you hadn't seen Vollard, if his nose was where you expect an ear to be, we'd notice that as strange, even if we have no idea what he looks like. It's the genre, the human face is the subject in art that it's hardest to lose this sort of illusion of the presence there in the work of art. So it's something you can fight with. Well, so imagine, if you had a photograph of your mother and someone asked you to scratch out the eyes in that photo. Now, you're sophisticated art history students, you know that images and what they represent are not the same thing at all. And you don't probably believe in magic, but still, I think you would say, I'm not going to do that. You'd feel uncomfortable about doing that, unless you hated your mother so much that you, which is a different story, But so there's a kind of, it's the area where it's hard to get rid of a sense of presence. So I think that's partly why Picasso was so interested in the human figure during these Cubist years. But I'm repeating myself, but as I say, it helps to indicate that he is interested in the world and not just in painting, although he wants you to be aware of both. I'd like to make two comparisons. One is with an artwork we've already seen. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the portrait of Vollard by Cézanne. So the same subject through the eyes of two different artists. And already, there's a sort of formal concern in the Cézanne. He's very much thinking of these sort of diamond shapes he's picking up. He's looking at it as a formal composition, as well as he's looking at it as a representation of a person. There's a balance between the two. So in a way, Picasso, I don't know what this... In a way, Picasso... is just shifting the balance a bit more, but I think exacerbating the balance. It's so much that you're really aware of forms first and the figure next. But the figure does come through, I think, especially after you've seen Cézanne's Vollard, you're getting a sense of Vollard from the Picasso painting, I think. His character comes through. The second comparison I'd like to make would be with a poem by Gertrude Steiner. I've mentioned her name before. She and her brother Leo were living in Paris and became friends with Picasso and Matisse and their circle. They would host a sort of gathering, a salon that the artists could attend. But she's an important American writer. In her own writing, often you get a sense of the words as words rather than what they mean. There's a sort of parallel to what Picasso is doing. So I'd like to read you some fragment of one of her poems, but actually this poem is about Picasso. It's called Picasso. It's from 1909, actually, so that dates it even a little bit earlier than this painting. But I think it gives you a sense of which was begun in 1909 but finished in 1910. It gives you a sense of a subject sort of gradually emerging from words, and you're very aware of the words as words. So it's a kind of verbal parallel. I won't read the whole thing because it would take too long. I'll just read the beginning parts of it. One whom some were certainly following was one who was completely charming. One whom some were certainly following was one who was charming. One whom some were following was one who was completely charming. One whom some were following was one who was certainly completely charming. Some were certainly following, and were certain that the one they were then following was one working, and was one bringing out of himself then something. Some were certainly following, and were certain that the one they were then following was one bringing out of himself then something that was coming to be a heavy thing, a solid thing, and a complete thing. One whom some were certainly following was one working, and certainly was one bringing something out of himself then, and was one who had been all his living, had been one having something coming out of him. So I think you get the idea. So it's almost like the same sense of each sentence is like a facet. It gives you a little bit, not that much, and then there's another facet that gives you something almost the same, perhaps, but it's slightly different, and it still doesn't give you much. But gradually, over time, I think you can already see, although I'm not giving you the whole poem, but you gradually see a person is emerging from this. But you have the words, and then through the words you have a sense of that person. And I think it's really fairly equivalent to what Picasso is doing here. Well, you can sort of play a little bit with your spectator, or you can respect your spectator. You're not children, I don't have to tell you every little thing, I can give you a few, I throw the ball to you and you can throw it back. I don't have to explain in great detail. It's another portrait by Picasso, staying with Picasso. There aren't really the same concerns with portraiture in Braque. That's one of the distinctions between them. it's getting pretty hard to make out the subject. This is 1910, the portrait of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler. It's becoming quite hermetic, quite difficult to read. I think at a certain point, Picasso is feeling that it's going a bit too far in a way, that we're getting too much of art and not enough of life, too much of form and not too much of what those forms represent, too much of signifiers and not enough of signified. This process seems to have its own internal logic. There's a journey, they don't know quite where this journey is going, but at a certain point they're ending up sort of in the undergrowth maybe. It's getting a little kind of difficult to read. I can imagine friends saying to them, well, I can't make it out, what is it, who is it, I can't see. They are trying to find ways to solve this. I mean, there are some areas in the painting which are a little bit clearer, like here, for instance, it's like a watch chain or something. He gives you little details a little bit more easy to read, little cues to help you solve the issue of what this thing is. The hair, maybe. Or, well, the human face is just the thing it's most easy for human beings. We're sort of probably deeply biologically programmed to recognize human faces, to know, are they smiling, are they angry, is this person a threat, etc. We can read faces very well with only a little bit of information. Even if it's dark, maybe you can make out the expression. So that's one way in which he's making the work more legible, but it's maybe not altogether satisfactory. It's a sort of going back to little illusionistic cues to some extent. And this work has really gone quite a long way. Remember, when we were looking at Braque's work in the last lecture, we saw how he broke down the boundaries of objects. He's much more concerned with space than Picasso. So that's one area in which he was sort of leading because of his interest in space. He's more willing to break down the integrity of the form of an object. But now here is Picasso following Braque in that. So compared to the portrait of Vollard, I think there's less sense of the boundary of the figure, more fragmentation, linking the figures and its background. Creating a compositional unity is a big concern for Cubism. That's partly why they're doing that kind of breakdown. But Picasso does pick out the figure tonally. There's no outlining really of the figure, but the light does nevertheless help you pick out where the figure is. After time, the more you look, the more you're able to. You have to do a work of interpretation. It's not, it's like the difference between, how, say, peanut butter comes in smooth and chunky. This is more the chunky kind. You've got to do some of the chewing yourself. It isn't already pre-processed like a realist painting might be, where everything is sort of laid on like baby food. It's all carefully, smooth together. And you don't have to do much work to eat it. This is rather more. You've got to get your teeth into it and be active as a spectator. And maybe you should be enjoying the game. Françoise Gillot, who was Picasso's partner in her book Life with Picasso, she talked about how Picasso and his secretary would exchange letters, and the letters were similar to the paintings in the sense that they were hard to understand what it was about, but it was a sort of game to try and work out for the participants. And it's almost, perhaps maybe they were talking about things they didn't want other people to know or something like that. So I'll just read you a little bit. She says, "Finally I learned the secret code of the palace guard. One never mentioned a proper name. One never referred directly to an event or a situation. One spoke of it only by allusion to something else. Picasso and Sabates, that's the name of his secretary, wrote to each other almost every day to impart information of no value and even less interest. So the content is not the important thing, the form is more important. But to impart it in the most artfully recondite fashion imaginable. It would have taken an outsider days, weeks, to fathom one of their arcane notes. It might be something related to Monsieur Pelletier, who handled Picasso's business affairs. Pablo would write, since Monsieur Pelletier had a country house in Touraine, of the man in the tower, Tours, of the castle, having suffered a wound in the groin, Ain, and so on, playing on words, splitting them up, recombining them into unlikely and suspicious-looking new words, like the pirate's torn-up map that must be pieced together to show the location of the treasure. He would sometimes use up 3 pages writing about a spade in such a way as not to be obliged to refer to it as a spade, lest the letter fall into the hands of Picasso's chambermaid, he mentions the name, or Madame Sabates, and reveal something to one or the other. He worked so hard at being hermetic that sometimes even Sabates didn't understand, and they would have to exchange several more letters to untangle the mystery. So this sort of the game of play with communication, or a meta-level concern with the language. It's almost like instead of using language, you become a linguist and analyze how language works. So instead of just doing straightforward painting, you become a painter who looks at the language of painting. Maybe at a certain point in painting history, you have to become self-conscious about what you're doing in order to move forward. There's a certain kind of sort of linear quality. Like the line is more important in Picasso than in Braque. And you don't quite see this, although it's complicated because they're in dialogue, and Braque picks it up to some extent from Picasso, but I think it comes more from Picasso, this kind of linear concern. And he's got here a sort of scaffolding quality, which, a sort of almost like a grid thing, but it's slightly irregular and, dynamic. Still, that's something more from Picasso, and Braque responds a bit to it. It's less volumetric, anyway, than more flatter, more two-dimensional than the Vollard one and other things that came before. As I said, Kahnweiler was an art dealer, so in the slide list that I gave out, I gave you, I thought you might be interested, the contracts. Timmy, sorry, you don't have this, and I've run out of the because I gave it out last time. A copy of Picasso and Braque's contract with Kahnweiler. He became the dealer who represented them. Actually, you can see that Picasso's already more important than Braque as an artist because he gets a longer, more detailed contract. I mean, anyone with legal training will probably, God, that's crazy. How can you just write a few sentences like that? But it's between friends, basically. The interesting thing in both of them is that the prices are fixed. They're fixed according to size, nothing to do with quality. It's not, I'm going to pay you more for the good ones or something like that. And this is, by the way, pretty standard, The other important thing is that it's a kind of monopolistic contract. He's agreed to buy everything that Picasso produces. That's good for Picasso. It means he has a guaranteed income. It's good for the dealer because it means he has a sort of monopolistic control. Oh, you want to buy a Picasso work? Well, you're going to have to come to me and I will tell you what's available and at what price, That's the basis on which the contract is concluded, to give a kind of control to the dealer and a certainty to the artist that they can paint what they like and it'll still be, they'll be able to make a living as long as they're productive. from the artist's point of view, I mean, this is interesting, I suppose, as economic history, but it's also interesting to us as art historians because it had some kind of influence on how they worked. You know, if you don't have to worry about getting your works into a autumn salon exhibition or something like that, of which there is a jury who may say, well, this is incomprehensible, or I don't understand. No. They might say no. You don't have to worry about that. You can be as obscure, as hermetic as you want to be. So maybe the style of how they're working is influenced by that economic circumstances. They didn't have to please anyone. Kahnweiler was pleased. He wrote a whole book about their work and was very, very happy with what they were doing. By the way, he didn't make much money out of it. His strategy seems to be more a long-term strategy. It's not really to the 1920s that many people were buying this Cubist work. He didn't even he did one or two exhibitions, but he didn't try to advertise and promote it very much. I think the idea was hold and sell later. You know, he had enough faith that these artists' work were historically important, and later people would want to buy. A few were sold, and interestingly, they were sold to relatively socially conservative people. Like there was a banker rich banker who bought them. It wasn't, apart from Gertrude Stein and her brother, they sort of avant-garde people from the avant-garde themselves who bought it. It was mostly those kind of, people from socially conservative elite that were concerned with it all. So, art as a commodity. There were a lot of picture dealers. Even in the I've got some of the figure. I think it. Let me see. Yeah, already by 1861 there are 104 picture dealers in Paris. So by this time there'd be a lot more. Artists who didn't have such a contract had to go before the jury of a autumn salon or wherever, and that would include artists like Delaunay and so forth. And as a result, actually, a lot of artists from other countries were more influenced by those secondary Cubists than they were by Picasso and Braque themselves, because those are the works you could see. Picasso and Braque didn't have to kind of engage with the public, really. It affected their art-making process, but also their influence in art history till a little bit later. They were known, but they weren't their art wasn't in public space in quite the same way. Marjolin, it's a figure painting. Picasso still very concerned with figure. Here's another strategy for making the works more understandable, putting writing onto the image. So it's a way of indicating that we need to get back to legibility to some extent. How do we do this without going back? Well, here's, I think, a good strategy for doing it without returning to illusionism. Writing helps give you a cue, but writing is itself a sort of abstract and flat. It belongs to the flat surface. Braque was the first to use letters and words on the surface of his Cubist paintings. Again, that's Braque leading Picasso. And Picasso follows in works like this, Marjolin, which is 1911 to 1912. Marjolin, my Pretty One, or something like that. It's two things. It's both the name of a popular song of the time, so it's a topical popular cultural reference, and it's also his pet name for his girlfriend, so it's a private reference. So it's got two different dimensions. This is even more difficult to make out than the Kahnweiler portrait. The female figure seems to have a musical instrument. And this is something equivalent by Braque, the Portuguese, 1911. You see how, sorry, in this room they haven't even got the projector set up properly, but anyway, you see how he stenciled lettering onto the surface. That affirms the two-dimensional surface. Maybe this is a figure in a restaurant, maybe a musician playing in a restaurant, and you see menu or something on the wall with prices, something like that might be what we're getting. Certainly there's a musical instrument. Often this is a not very good image in fact, but often the surface of Braque's paintings are more interesting in this time than Picasso's, more painterly you could say. Braque had trained as a house painter, as a way of making a living. And he introduced techniques like how to imitate wood graining. That's like an interior decorator sort of technique. He starts to use that as, again, it's a way of introducing legibility in the painting. You want to represent something that's made of wood. Well, let's use this imitation wood graining technique to kind of indicate woodiness. Without going back to illusionism, we can give some greater information. Picasso was taught by Picasso and follows on. Braque also tried thickening his paint with sand. He's interested in the sort of the materiality of the paint, of the painted object, the thingness of it, as they both were. So there's something of a problem, and there are various strategies for trying to deal with that problem. The biggest one is a breakthrough by Picasso. Oh, this, I should say, was one of the paintings bought by the banker La Roche. He bought the Portuguese. And this was the breakthrough work by Picasso that introduced something which was going to go on and change Cubism really, and that is collage, gluing onto the surface, into the image, material from some other source. So this is his still life from 1912, the first collage. What is glued in is a piece of cloth overprinted with a design of chair caning. So in this particular case, the thing glued in is itself a representation, illusionistic representation of something within the still life. So it's perhaps to represent like a chair or something on which these different objects are sitting. It's a mixture of collage and paint in this particular first instance, and the paint sort of intrudes over onto the collaged element as if those objects are on top of it and casting shadows onto it. What are those objects? Well, I think we make out a glass, a wine glass, and a newspaper, journal. That's the name of a newspaper. Although we only see the first three letters of the name, the rest is hidden behind other objects. That's how we're supposed to read space anyway. Little cues tell us about space. We don't need any more information, illusionistic disposition of forms in a 3D space. But those three letters on their own are already enough to make a word. In French, it's the word for game. So yeah, this is all playfulness in a way. The subject matter of Cubism generally is often something quite sort of cool and witty. A lot of it is reference to the studio space. So it's again kind of art about art. And things that were lying around the studio, or everyday life objects, could be in any room, I suppose, a wine glass, a newspaper, musical instruments. Picasso decorated his studio with it. He didn't, I think, himself play a guitar, but guitars were there. So this is a really big breakthrough. You can imagine they were really starting to worry that their work was becoming difficult to read, hermetic, too hermetic. They need, because their concern is not to go towards abstraction, they're not trying to get to a pure formalism. They want reality to be there. Here's a means to bring it back in. You can imagine people saying, "Oh, your paintings are so unrealistic, it's nothing like the real world." Then, okay, well, how about to represent a newspaper in my painting, I'm going to have an actual newspaper glued into the painting. Is that realistic for you? It's more realistic than your oil painting of a newspaper could be. This is you're worried about. It's not real enough. This is as real. This is reality itself. Within the world of a painting. So stop bugging me about reality and whether there's enough reality in my art. That question is now over. And let's get on with the more interesting thing of saying whether it's an interesting composition, whether it works as a work of art. So a lot of objects are represented by themselves in that way, a sample of the reality they refer to. They say an index rather than an iconic representation of something. In this particular work, there's also this, first I should say the oval quality. Yeah, that's worth noting. That kind of oval focus in the composition is there in certain works by Braque, even when the works themselves are square or rectangle, more likely rectangle. He often has a sort of oval reference, but here the whole thing is oval. Often the corners are quite difficult areas to bring into a composition, so actually cutting them out might be interesting, and it also makes the composition more dynamic. You've got all these kind of straight lines, diagonals, active, jagged forms, but you've also got the sort of curved form of the edge itself playing into everything. And you've got this rope frame, that's very innovative sort of framing, but I think that also kind of emphasizes the sense of the thingness of the painting as an object, rather than just what it represents. So a lot of the collages that follow after, there's one big influence that collage has on the development of their art, and that is a sort of simplification. That first collage work was pretty complicated in terms of having all those little fragmented forms still, but gradually the process leads towards a simplification. We see less and less complicated forms, and sometimes this second phase of Cubism is called synthetic Cubism. By using objects, somehow it simplifies things. We've moved here to look at a Braque collage work, composition with Ace of Clubs. And you see he's collaged in bits of paper on which he's created artificial wood effects, a technique he'd already developed. So he's linking collage with drawing. He never linked collage with oil paint, unlike Picasso. And also he never made an image, I believe, just of collaged elements themselves. He's always got something else. whereas Picasso has produced works which is nothing but collage. Well, this is another Braque collage, putting these two side by side. This is The Man with a Pipe, 1912. Actually, I think compositionally it's really rather similar to this one that we just looked at. You know, one's a still life, one's a human figure, yet compositionally they're rather similar. It seems to say that subject matter is not that important, perhaps. Still using these sort of flattening forms of imitation wood. The aria of Braque. Aria de Braque. Yeah, this is a good example to show how collage can simplify the form of a cubist image. All the proliferation of fragmented planes has disappeared, and there's a greater legibility. But focusing on a few things like a guitar, everyone knows what a guitar looks like. So just a kind of it's not even a complete whole, it's just a kind of semi-circular form and a few lines. 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, most guitars would have 6 strings, but 4 is enough. We still know it's a guitar. They're not even continuous. You know, you can break it up because it's more interesting lines. Lines and circles are good forms that you can use. The external forms of the guitar are also very lovely forms to play with. Very lovely for your composition. And the forms of your collaged elements don't have to fit at all with the object. Maybe you can indicate the woodiness of the guitar with a big wedge like this that's got nothing to do with the actual shape of the guitar. Some other thing in the image is giving you a sense of the shape. That's enough. One of the things that, and writing of course helps specify things, the musical theme, sheet music, cover of. Musical Forms, 1918. That's quite a late example. You know, well, here you don't have a title of the music, you just have a few lines to give you the sheet music feel. Clarinet. Well, he breaks the corrugated paper into 2 parts. That creates an illusion of it continuing behind. So this playfulness of actual flatness and illusions of the third dimension. In fact, this paper is on top of everything else, but it reads as if it's behind the guitar. One guitar is made up of 2 main forms, but just by putting that little drawn mark there helps to link the 2 together, makes it one object as well as two things. The shadow is on top of the object, more solid than the object itself. Or this, you know, this is the guitar, this is not the guitar, but it's the same, but it doesn't matter, you can still read it. One thing that collage does is to introduce a sort of double-voiced quality into art. There's the voice of the style of the artist, and then there's a voice of the style of the material that is introduced in. It could be a very different style. So a lot of that happens in later art, the double voice quality comes back, say, with a lot of postmodern art, where there's more than one style there. Maybe all this begins with collage. Collage is very influential. Collage allows you to bring different realities side by side within the same work. You know, surrealism does that, brings together 2 different, very different things juxtaposed very often. You know, this concern with illusionism is there in some 19th century art. And I think this is sort of there in the background behind what Picasso and Braque are doing. Or the still life subject matter of music is there in the work of Chardin and other earlier artists. It's all sort of there in the background. Picasso, using a newspaper to represent a newspaper. sometimes then the collage elements can introduce references to modern life. There may be, this is art made in the period just before the outbreak of the First World War, so sometimes there's references to conflict coming up, or there's a little bit of joking, like there's one I think where he represents the teeth area, mouth area by an advert for a dentist, and the chest area of a figure by something to do with tuberculosis, things like that. There's one where there's a reference to a conflict. It says, the headline says, "The battle is engaged," and that could be reference to their artistic battles, if you like, or there's one where it says the future is in the air. It's talking about the Wright brothers' flight. That's also a little bit like Cubism. You get up into the air just with a few little bits of cloth and rope or whatever, and wood, and yet you manage to get up into the air. Cubism, you're making art, but just from a few little everyday objects, and that's enough somehow to get you up into the air of art. Actually, I made a mistake. The mouth was not a dentist. It was an ad for breath freshener. That's the... Again, it's the game. The battle is engaged. Yeah. Yeah, the same form that can represent a guitar could represent an ear. It could also represent a woman's body, a torso. So forms take on their own life. It's like a form decides what it's going to represent, rather than you have a subject matter and then the form serves to represent that. So from one image to another, the meaning could be quite different. And he pushes it in, Picasso, not really Braque, pushes this into 3 dimensions. It's a shallow relief sculpture, so it's not that far from the world of a painting. You can hang it on a wall like a painting. The idea of joining things together, which is there in collage, is pushed into 3 dimension. It's a whole new way of making sculpture that develops from this moment, bringing together, welding together, or joining together somehow different objects to make a sculpture, instead of carving or modelling, the 2 other main methods. And such a collage principle is used into Picasso's later work too. It's not just during the Cubist period, but all the way through. So an example from his later work would be this one, a good example, I think, with a bull's head made just from 2 elements of a racing bicycle, the seat and the handlebars. It wouldn't work if you can't see the bicycle as well as the bull. You need to have both for it to be interesting. If you could only see the bull, it wouldn't be anything. You have to see the process of transformation, the metamorphosis. So there's a whole sort of dimension of sculpture that is concerned with assembling objects in the 20th century that really goes back to this, and this goes back to collage. So the whole story, begins in this way. Collage is a really radical invention. People had made images by, in a scrapbook or whatever. You can make a little design of things that you've added together. But what Picasso and Braque do is really something a little bit different. And one further thing I should have said, another thing that collage does is it brings back not just a simplification of the formal vocabulary, but it brings back colour. Colour can come back into the work of the Cubists in this later phase. Colour could be separate from form, not that you have to, the same thing, colour could be indicated by a different piece of paper or something. Okay, thanks. I'll keep you a little bit late, but obviously I wanted to get to the end of this story of the close collaboration between Picasso and Braque. So then on Tuesday we can start looking at Picasso's work from the post-Cubist phase. Well, he's never completely a post-Cubist. He's always still exploring the possibilities of Cubism, but he does other things as well.